Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about the human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 6, we're asking if and how our human rights are threatened by the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Todd Landman. In today's episode, recorded on the eve of Joe Biden's presidential inauguration, I'm delighted to be joined by Attorney Dominique, who heads up Daylight, a collective that seeks to achieve community justice by strengthening culturally competent voices for meaningful and lasting change. Dominique is also the chairperson of the UN Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent and has spoken powerfully about businesses that have been supercharged through the atrocity of slavery and the ways in which white supremacy has been exploited at a global level. So Dominique, it's wonderful to have you here on this episode of the Rights Track, so welcome.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So our theme really is this linkage between COVID-19 and human rights, and your work really looks at the human rights of people of African descent across the world. And I guess I just want to open with this observation that there seems to be a disproportionality of experience, which is to say that COVID seems to be affecting people of African descent more than other groups in society. What are the sort of explanations that are being leveraged to understand that phenomenon?
Yeah, I think one important and tragic outcome of COVID-19 is it's really shown how our policy decisions continue to be grounded in the legacy of systemic racism and the trade and trafficking in enslaved Africans and colonialism and the ways that we have seen Black and brown bodies as there for exploitation, available for service, available to exploit opportunities. And in this space specifically, this massive racial disparities we've seen in who gets COVID-19, who has access to healthcare, who gets severe illness, and then who dies, has continued throughout the pandemic, even as the data has reflected these massive racial disparities and the impact of policy from the very beginning. And so this is an important moment to think about both our commitment to human rights and the ways that systemic racism are global, not local in their manifestation.
That's really interesting. And I guess I want to push you a little bit because there are things that one might call structural, long-term socioeconomic disadvantage, inequality, those sorts of factors. There are those things that you're referring to as policy. So, the way in which things are rolled out, decisions that are taken at the highest levels of government or in public healthcare services or private healthcare services, etc. And then there's a role for sort of volition, agency, and intentionality. Which of those major factors do you think, plays the biggest part in it? Is it down to somebody intentionally denying someone, or is it more this structural, long-term, historical perspective that you brought in your first answer?
I mean, I think it's a good question, but I would actually resist that taxonomy. I don't think our biggest and most pervasive systemic racism is people intentionally seeking the opportunity to denigrate or eradicate people of African descent, right? That's not necessarily the space that we're most concerned about. Although, as we've seen in recent days, there are those people, right? There are people who are absolutely and openly committed to this idea of white supremacy. At the same time, we understand that systemic racism proceeds through individual decision-making by people with subjective amounts of power and subjective perspectives, right? Subjective decision-making that is informed by what people are used to. So you have, for example, plenty of research that suggests that medical bias continues to be an important issue, particularly when doctors are under stress, when they have too many patients, when they're not getting sleep. We've seen that in the emergency departments. Research has shown that doctors default to biased decision-making that disadvantages people of African descent. And in COVID-19, we've seen Black physicians getting on social media saying, look how I was treated, and I'm a physician. I know what should be happening. I've specifically asked and advocated for myself. The specific physician who made that statement ultimately died, right? But in these spaces, we see the decision-making by one person with a limited amount of power really operationalizing the systemic racism, really operationalizing the root to these racial disparities And yet, although we knew about this before the pandemic, although plenty of people were raising the alarm about things like medical bias, it continues to be a conversation that's not being had. So we can talk about policy decisions at the high level, but these are also well reflected in individual decision making that may not be filled with racial animus at very local levels. And so these things intersect, right? They intersect in ways that are almost difficult to disaggregate, to pull apart, because that is literally the nature of systemic racism. That is how it has developed, by inserting itself into the very fabric of our society and our decision making.
I think that's fascinating, and that idea of, whether it's witting or unwitting, a decision is taken. It is informed by presumption, assumption, and bias that is either acknowledged or not acknowledged, and yet the consequences and ramifications and the aggregation of all these individual decisions produces this aggregation of disproportionality, if you will, this idea of, this known fact and statistic now that we know people of African descent, African Americans in the American situation, for example, are getting sicker, they're dying at a greater rate than other people. It feels insidious, and yet you link it back to a very long history of these things having happened in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, when we talk about looking at the data and disaggregated data, we understand that every single piece of data starts with an individual who's making a decision. And it's the acculturation, right? It's the social conditioning that we've received our entire lives, myself included, right? Through education, through the media, of whose lives matter, whose lives don't, what is considered a problem. Can you solve, for example, the problem of COVID-19 without providing an equally viable solution on the continent of Africa, right? We know, like the Pfizer vaccine, for example, there's been some statement that will not be provided in Africa. We understand, luckily, there may be some other options, but have you solved a problem if you haven't solved it for everyone? And that's the question, right? And we saw this also, to be honest, with the HIV epidemic. When you define a problem narrowly enough that the solution is a solution that is adequate for a majority, highly resourced white population, that is actually making a decision along the lines of race about whose lives matter, whose lives are prioritized, whose lives are there to be exploited. And we've seen this again and again in COVID-19. We've seen it in education, we've seen it in the economy, we've seen it in health practices. And we have to understand that the individual making that decision, the individual reacting out of their own bias, is not separate from the society that produces that individual, from the unspoken messages that accredit that decision making, and from the impact that is not just disproportionate but devastating to communities of African descent. Early on in this pandemic, the head of the emergency department at NYU Hospital, which is here in New York City, it's one of the best hospitals in the world, put out an email that was leaked to the Wall Street Journal that said, listen, we're not going to have the luxury of time, data, or committees to make decisions about who gets ventilated, who gets access to care. It's going to be you doctors on the ground making these kinetic decisions quickly and without the benefit of review, of policy, of supervision. And what's interesting is, when we talk about human rights and the right to health, every hospital in this country, right, has protocols for things like life and death decisions, so that doctors actually do have the expectation that they will look at data, they will talk to committees, they will flip these decisions when they become sort of systemic, like everybody needs a ventilator, we don't have that many, that they will flip these decisions up a level. And yet, and early on in the pandemic, right, a space charged with preserving health put out this kind of blank check for doctors to rely on their instincts, meaning for doctors to rely on bias, even in the ways that they made decisions about an overwhelming patient caseload in the face of a pandemic we'd never seen before, right? So this idea that systemic racism is just for the people we see acting, crazy on TV is not accurate. In fact, the fact that we've been able to identify bias through research virtually everywhere we look for it, and bias, when I say bias, against people of African descent, everywhere we look for it, gives us a responsibility to account for that in our policymaking. Yet in COVID-19, despite evidence of bias, evidence that a pandemic would disproportionately hit Black and Brown communities, despite all of this front-end information, the possibility and the reality of racial disparities that have been devastating to Black and Brown communities were ignored and largely continue to be ignored.
Yeah, and I was going to take you back to that time in New York. I mean, the pandemic hit early in 2020, and New York was the epicenter, partly because of the influx of folks into JFK Airport, but other migrations and other factors. But this observation about the disproportional impact on black and brown people almost was communicated initially in the press as a surprise. They said, oh, look, once we aggregate all the cases, now that they're coming in, look what's happening here. But what you're actually saying is we knew this all along well before, that there would that this would be the outcome. And the leaked email basically gave, as you say, maybe a blank check is one way of saying it, but, that doctors were thrown into a very gut instinct, quick decision making in the absence of protocol data and everything else, because the volume of patients was so high, and yet the outcome of that decision making produces these disparities that were kind of expected a priori.
Yeah, and I think it's important in this moment and I was in New York during this period, and it was devastating. It was terrifying. No one is suggesting there wasn't stress, but knowing that stress itself creates not just the possibility, but the expectation of enhanced racial bias, of enhanced racial disparities, certainly suggests that some action taken to inform, to make doctors more aware, to mitigate, to even think about how individual doctors could mitigate racial bias in their decision-making is especially important in that space. And yet that wasn't happening. Certainly people like me were making statements very, very early on that this is something we need to address head on and early on, even if it's just talking about the reality of it, talking about this research in a space where people struggle to understand their own complicity in either white privilege or systemic racism. And what we heard from some doctors, including some doctors at NYU, and not to pick on NYU because there's a lot of complicity to go around, but we heard from some doctors was that they were shut down. They were threatened with being sidelined, with losing their positions, that healthcare providers in those spaces bringing this up were not just not listened to, but were forcibly quieted. And that tells you that this isn't an unknown problem. It was just an unwelcome problem. And that is what we need to confront when we're talking about dismantling systemic racism. The fact that we actually know it exists. We didn't need the data to understand that. In fact, a lot of the data is for the people who are engaged in the denialism, right? What we needed the data for was to create some universal understanding.
Yes, and I've challenged this for years after the Ferguson shooting. You look at the data from the United States in terms of the outcome of a violent encounter with the police, or even a non-violent encounter with the police, and police killing and the disproportionality of killing. And you look at the statistics and you say, actually, the Ferguson case was not an aberration. It's a very typical case in, the patterns of the use of force from police forces in the United States. And I got absolutely attacked online for even suggesting that this was true. And yet years later, we see the George Floyd murder, we see the Black Lives Matter protest, which actually drew tremendous support from a broad range of people. The way in which that was constructed by many, and the reaction to it, and the contrast between the law enforcement preparation for the Black Lives Matter in Washington D.C. versus the Save America was raised in the press over the last couple of weeks. This the kind of this expectation that we need this law and order presence because Black Lives Matter are coming. And then the whataboutism argument we heard in the floor of Congress saying, well, you didn't say anything about these protests, but now you're all up in arms about the protests in the Capitol, and that kind of false equivalence in the use of rhetoric it doesn't help at all. And I think it was a commentator on CNN who said, well, Black Lives Matter activists were arrested, actually, and probably many more of them were arrested than are being arrested and prosecuted under the current circumstances. I wonder how you feel about all of that. I know it's about a year's worth of activity, but seriously, what is your commentary on this trajectory, if you will, and this false equivalence between protest movement over injustice versus this insurrection on the national Capitol?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting to think about, I agree, the false equivalence is really attractive to people, right? People love to create a both sides argument and then render absolute truth to the status of bald opinion. But what we've seen, right, what we've seen in these spaces is that even the response, even the expectation of threat, even the expectation of protest that could escalate to violence was experienced very differently by law enforcement and the security services when it's Black protesters versus when it's white protesters. And of course, then we see the outcomes actually also look very different. I and many other people watched stunned as the US Capitol was stormed, and still uh, preparations for the inauguration are going on right now, and they're showing photographs of broken windows and ongoing damage to the building that may or may not get fixed before a presidential inauguration happens tomorrow. These spaces where the way the muscle of law enforcement, the way the muscle of the security apparatus responds is so dictated by the race of the protesters, by the race and the color of the protest, is not unconnected to history, is not disconnected from the fact that the foundation of our country is interwoven with commitments around white supremacy, the foundation of our modern global economy that involves, right, the trafficking of people and goods and services to serve, right, the theft or the trafficking of Black people in order to create and sustain a modern global economy where things like sugar could never have been a commercial product if you couldn't work people who look like me to death every 5 to 7 years. These spaces have always been connected to how law enforcement has developed, how the security muscle has perceived threat, even in spaces as high as our federal government in this country, as all international spaces. I mean, it's interesting, right? When you look at the origin of even policing, this started in the US with slave patrols. And that's a model we've exported, we as Americans have exported all over the world. It's a challenge to separate policing from the racism of policing, because in fact, policing was always about surveilling and controlling certain bodies to protect the property of certain people. And that was always racialized. And the fact that we've seen very racialized responses that people would love to say, oh, it's this, this is just like this. People love to create that false equivalence. But the fact that we've seen very racialized responses, it's not surprising. It's actually predicted, not just by history, but by the development of our own spaces or of our modern global economy.
Well, I was really struck by two things from many things from the events of the last couple of weeks. But I noted the way police were gently holding people's hands and leading them out of the Capitol building down the steps to make sure they didn't trip. And I thought, wow, that's a very nice, genteel way of exiting a popular insurrectionist from a building. Now, they didn't do that for everybody, but I was struck by that image. The other one, which, forgive me for saying, I mean, there was a white man being arrested with, pinned to the ground, being handcuffed in usual fashion. And he actually said on video, "You're treating me like a Black man." I mean, that encapsulates what you've just said, right?
Yeah. And we hear that a lot. It's actually funny how often you could go back over videos in the last 5 or 10 years and you would see that statement happening a lot in lots of different contexts, that ultimately we even baseline whiteness in our expectations of how we will be treated when we are not in compliance with the law, not in compliance with certain social mores. And that space, I think, is really complicated for people like me to accept, because it suggests that this baselining of white supremacy is really ever present in ways that can be very challenging, if not psychologically devastating, for people to confront. And yet it's hard to imagine that we can create more racial justice, more racial awareness, more equality, more equity without really dismantling these legacy mindsets. And I don't know that I see a lot of that happening in local spaces. That's a lot of the work I do. And it's shocking how many of the same stories I hear organization to organization, community to community, country to country. When we're talking about anti-Black racism, it takes on very predictable and familiar forms, irrespective of context. And that's telling in and of itself.
Yeah, it's hugely challenging. I guess the other observation that really struck me was this estate agent from Texas who hired a private jet to fly to Capitol Hill to go on the protest, takes pictures of herself in front of the broken windows, and then makes a public plea on television that the president should pardon her. And again, that's a kind of expectation that, well, I was just following orders, which we know in the Nuremberg trials was eliminated as a credible defense, but also this expectation that somebody somewhere, she said, they're going to arrest me and put me in prison, but I'd like a pardon from the president, please. So that expectation of leniency, I think, encapsulates a lot of what you've just shared with us.
I think it's the ways that people, even in the absence of reading the Constitution, right, the ways that people fully expected that their behavior, including incredibly violent behavior towards the very police officers they claim to support in principle, then the idea that should not be punished, that should not face consequences, and that in some way that they were entitled to do that because they were displeased with the outcome of an election that was already stacked against Black and brown voters who've been massively disenfranchised through policy in the last, many years.
Yes, and who were quite effectively mobilized in the state of Georgia, as we learned. But I wonder if we could bring the conversation back to COVID, and I'm interested now in vaccinations. So, the great saving vaccination is here. You've already mentioned that Pfizer vaccine may not be sent to Africa. And we know there's a differential take-up of the vaccine as well as the rollout of the vaccine in the United States, and certainly in the UK, we're having our own struggles here in terms of rollout, but it seems to be picking up pace now. But underlying decisions about who gets vaccinated first. We hear stories about the most vulnerable population, and that tends to be defined by age rather than by color of skin. I wonder what your feeling is about what's happening in terms of the distribution of the vaccine and the ways in which people will get access to it in a timely fashion.
I have a lot of concerns, right? I think what we're seeing in the U.S. and some other places is that the distribution is turning out to be a huge problem. Here in New York, there are these people are lining up for first come first serve with the idea that even where there is vaccine to be distributed, they're struggling to distribute it to the right people before it expires. And so we have distribution problems generally, and it's disappointing, right? Because ultimately we knew this was coming. As with every other phase of COVID-19, we've kind of failed to step into our best and most resourced selves, right? This is an incredibly rich country. We have social media, we have so many tools, and yet we're struggling to be excellent in the ways that we handle this. And in fact, I was talking to somebody in Europe yesterday who just let me know that all of Europe and everywhere else is just laughing at the US. And maybe I can't even deny that. At the same time, right, what we see is, great, give it to healthcare providers, give it to people living in nursing homes. The protocol is fine, but understand when you're thinking about these protocols, think about race, think about the home health aides who have kept how many elderly people out of the hospital, out of the healthcare system. Think about the drivers and the grocery delivery personnel and the essential workers who are being disproportionately infected in places like the UK and the US, but aren't necessarily seen for the role they're playing in helping people maintain quarantine and in creating a better public health response. Absolutely agree that people in nursing homes, that healthcare providers need to be prioritized in the vaccine response, but we also need to explicitly think about race in this vaccine response. When we're talking about pervasive, systematic racial disparities in multiple countries, it suggests that our policy itself is reifying and rejuvenating forms of systemic racism that we may not even be fully aware of. And as we talk about vaccines, we need to also talk about things like racial equity.
And how do you feel about this observation that there's a high proportion of African Americans who don't want to take the vaccine? Is that a true observation? And if so, what's behind the reticence to take a vaccine?
I think we'll see, right? I think a lot of people don't trust the vaccine, and I think it has to do with history. People are very aware of the Tuskegee experiment. They're aware of Henrietta Lacks. They're aware of the ways that Black and brown people have been exploited in the name of scientific or medical progress. And those are facts, right? So that's not about people distrusting doctors or distrusting the system. That is about absolutely rational decision making in the face of atrocities that have been inflicted on a community. That said, we've seen a really great job of a lot of, including Black and brown doctors, diving in, understanding what it's about, saying the mRNA vaccine is not a live vaccine where you could catch something, talking about the difference between the withholding care and the Tuskegee experiments and the giving of care in this vaccine. And that conversation respects that the distrust that you see in Black communities is grounded in truth, is grounded in watching people go crazy from syphilis and not being allowed any care in Tuskegee, right? And that conversation respects that people's fears may be legitimate, right? May be grounded in historical reality, and the racial disparities themselves accredit the need to be thoughtful, careful, and risk averse. So I hear a lot of people saying, oh, it's unproductive to talk about being concerned about the vaccine. It's unproductive to voice doubt. But the way I see it is that it's absolutely important to respect that this is not skepticism that comes from ignorance, although, you know, we certainly see that on the other side of the aisle, right? This is skepticism that comes from history. And the only way to break that down is to engage in both community organizing and community conversations that really understand that people's fears and concerns come from a very legitimate, well-grounded place in history, right? It's not an anti-intellectual or anti-science concern. It's a concern grounded in the history of science.
Yeah, you know, fact-based skepticism. So in closing, I'd like you to look into a crystal ball for me. And my question really is, there's a transition to a new presidential administration. The vaccine, let's say, gets rolled out. And, you know, this time next year, you're sitting in New York City. You know, what's the future look like? And, you know, what are the next steps need to be taken to address this wide range of issues that you've identified? I know it's a somewhat unfair question, but in an ideal world, what is it you want to happen next to really hit head on some of the things you shared with us on this episode?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question because in reality, the problems happening in the US, this is a large country geographically, population-wise. The problems happening in the US, the problems happening in the world are not the result of one administration, of one leader, of one organization. Right? I live in New York City, which is run by the other party, right? And many of these problems that I talk about with distribution are local problems. The problems I talk about with hospitals are local problems. So I think a thing that needs to happen is some honest after action and lessons learned, where we look at what happened, where were their failures, how has our systemic racism dictated outcomes for Black and brown communities. I haven't seen so much of that happening yet. We're barely even keeping track of who actually is dying of COVID well, right? For a while in New York City, we had these mass graves on an island because they couldn't move bodies fast enough. So there is this sort of public health emergency and this overlaid tragedy, but at the same time, we're not actually confronting the racism of this, and instead pivoting towards this story of, oh, we're all in this together. It's a pandemic. It's a global pandemic. And yet the fact that we're seeing it play out in such racialized ways that disproportionately situate tragedy towards Black and brown people is something we need to look at, both in terms of our healthcare structures, our policy making, our prioritization, individual bias, you name it. And what I'd like to see a year from now is a really honest look at what happened, what didn't happen, and how do we avoid that happening again, right? The fact that a pandemic shows up and everybody abandons the things we already know, which is that there is a lot of bias that dictates outcomes for Black and brown people. That is not acceptable, no matter what the emergency is. When we're talking about human rights, your right to health, your right to education, when we're talking about human rights, these are things we have to hold to stronger at times of global emergency, not less so. And yet, we've really struggled to do that.
Absolutely brilliant, set of remarks there to close out this conversation. I like this idea of the honest after action and an honest looking at everything. In many ways, the pandemic has held a massive magnifying glass up to long-standing conflicts in society and really showed us those in high relief. And yet we can't just say, oh, we got through the pandemic and go back to normal. We need an honest looking at all of this and addressing all of the many issues that you raised with us today. But for now, I think you've absolutely shone a light on so many of the contradictions, complexities, and just the tragedy of all of this. But it's nice to hear you end with, we need to hold on to human rights. And I think that's what we're all about here on the Rights Track. So for now, Dominique Day, thank you ever so much for being on this episode of the Rights Track.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about the podcast at www.rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the Economic and Social Research Council. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to access all forthcoming episodes and our fantastic back catalogue of 5 series of sound evidence on human rights.